Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks, and I also write Bowtie Law. Thank you all for tuning in today for our first CLE webinar. This is approved for 1 hour of ethics in California. We have shared the written materials in chat, and we'll be happy to email those if you don't have them. If you weren't able to download them, please let me know. And we will have other forms at the end of the webinar for records of attendance and everything. We have a wonderful agenda today covering many episodes of Star Trek, and we will get into those in just a moment. But first, let's meet our panelists. We have Circuit Judge John B. Owens from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Owens is a graduate of Stanford University Law School, where he came in first in his class. He has the distinction of having clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the United States Supreme Court. And just to go a little beyond the norm, his favorite Star Trek series is the original series. His favorite ship is the original Enterprise, and favorite episode, Balance of Terror. Also with us is attorney Bethany Bangford. Her favorite series is The Next Generation. Favorite ship is the Enterprise NC-1701-D. And favorite episodes, Best of Both Worlds. Bethany is a graduate of Stanford. She focuses on patent litigation and is currently clerking for a federal judge. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm a graduate of McGeorge School of Law. I have loved Star Trek all of my life. My favorite episode is Darmok from The Next Generation. Favorite ship is the Enterprise refit seen in the motion picture. Not my favorite film. And favorite series is Deep Space Nine. So let's jump into the one episode that has a complete trial and hits many excellent ethical issues, and that's Judgment from Enterprise. Highly recommend this series because we see a full trial that actually has a verdict. It's one of the few that actually get to the resolution of a case. And in this case, Captain Archer is being prosecuted by the Klingon Empire for an attack on a Klingon ship. There's a lot of he said, she said type battle that takes place between the Klingon captain, who's been reduced in rank, who was basically trying to kill a bunch of refugees, and the Enterprise saved them. So that raises a bunch of issues when the Klingons capture Archer and they are trying to prosecute him for interfering in the Klingon Empire, and they want to execute him for it. Now, we have a prosecutor named Orak. The rules for prosecutors are heightened than for a regular attorney because a prosecutor in a criminal case shall refrain from prosecuting a charge that the prosecutor knows is not supported by probable cause. This is problematic because Captain Duras, or former Captain Duras, lies on the stand. His entire testimony is the probable cause for prosecuting Archer. The fact that that's a lie means there's no probable cause to bring charges against Archer. That's not good for an attorney who's a prosecutor to bring a charge knowing that a witness is lying, and that witness is the foundation of probable cause. Now let's pivot over to the defense attorney who was Kolos, who also played General Martog in Deep Space Nine. And we have the issue for competency with an attorney, saying a lawyer should not intentionally, recklessly, or with gross negligence repeatedly fail to perform legal services. Now, at the beginning of the case, Kolos is just kind of dialing in the defense, doesn't cross-examine Captain Duras. The problem with that is Duras lied. Truthfulness is always relevant in any trial. So being able to impeach him and being able to call him out for his lie is mission critical in Archer's defense. And at the beginning, he doesn't really do that. But eventually he does remember, oh, I've been dialing this in for too long, and he steps up and he gives a very vigorous defense for Archer. While they don't use the word competency or duty of loyalty or duty of candor, they use the word honorable. And that is basically a catch-all in Klingon jurisprudence for everything that we would consider to be competent representation. Highly recommend this episode because it hits all of the high points for how to argue in court and why we have trials. Well, let's pivot over.
John,
Yes, Your Honor.
I just wanted to jump in real quick. I mean, the one lesson that Kolos forgot was that defense attorneys often say at the end of the day, I get to go home and maybe my client doesn't. In this case, in this episode, Kolos did not get to go home.
No, he did not get to go home. And it's a wonderful performance. Highly recommend this one. Well, let's pivot over to another Klingon trial, and that's from Deep Space Nine, the episode Rules of Engagement. And Bethany's going to take this, but to set the stage, Worf is facing an extradition hearing because in the conflict with the Klingon Empire with the Federation, the Defiant destroys a Klingon commercial ship allegedly full of civilian passengers, and they want to prosecute him. So there are lots of big ethical issues here. So Bethany, what are some of these ethical issues? And let's talk about how they come up in the episode.
Sure. So really what underlies this is that we're the transport vessel, and they've determined that it's what's in his heart at the time that he blows the ship up that matters, because apparently if he was acting on his Klingon instincts, then that's a basis for extradition in this world. So ignoring that as a basis for extradition, there's a lot of testimony about what he was feeling and whether he has these Klingon battle instincts and how they manifest in the holodeck and these other situations. It turns out at the end of the episode that the civilian transport vessel was actually a fake. All the names that they listed as civilians being present on this vessel were actually civilians that had narrowly escaped being blown up on a different vessel, and they're like, this is too coincidental. So it turns out the whole thing was staged. So obviously, that's false evidence, which is highly unethical, and it was just a way of trying to get their claws into this space system and this wormhole. And then there was another part of the episode where the attorney, Ch'pak, tells Captain Sisko that if he concedes on extradition, that he will defend Worf in Klingon court and essentially spare his life. And Captain Sisko just outright says no, that they're not going to do this. And obviously under our law, that would be a plea offer that he would have to present to Worf, and there's absolutely no evidence that he did that at all here. And Josh, I think you're still muted.
Excellent. Thank you, Bethany. It's an excellent trial episode and highly recommend it. Let's go over to another Deep Space Nine episode because they averaged one trial episode a season, and that is Tribunal, which gets into rights to a fair trial. And Judge Owens, while we talk about some of the big issues with what happens to Miles O'Brien, he's stopped in Bajoran space, he's arrested without charges stated, he's stripped, there's a retina scan, a tooth removed, charges aren't announced to trial, and the verdict's already given. You were a federal prosecutor before being a judge. What are some of your reactions to the Cardassian legal system?
Well, first I would say that Miles O'Brien is the checkoff of Deep Space Nine, that everything bad seems to happen to him on every episode. Well, look, in many ways, that episode is an issue spotter for a law school examination for criminal procedure. Really, every single amendment you can imagine has been violated in this case. Obviously, Fourth Amendment's been violated, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, and so forth. every procedural thing we have in play. I think to me, the most interesting part of the episode was, and there's a slide you have about it, about the defense attorney. I said prosecutor because it's basically really that's what he was. But the defense attorney in this case really was not a defense attorney as we see it. And I think, Josh, you have a slide prior to this one, the ethical duty of competency. In this episode, the defense attorney, all he cares about is that his client his client's apparently already been convicted, but that nothing upsets the fact that his client's been convicted. That's all he cares about. And if there's ever a time when anyone suggests that's not his role, he becomes very upset. And at one point, he even asked to be withdrawn from the case because he's so concerned about the fact that we want this guilty verdict to remain in place against Mr. O'Brien, to the point that because we want society to be calm and order. Everything in the case is about order and society and what the outside thinks about the result, rather than zealously advocating for your client. Now, obviously, if you're a zealous advocate, you have to play within the rules, candor to the court, and we'll talk about some of those issues today. But at no time can your eye be on any ball other than your own client's. So really, I think the writers of this episode very cleverly used it in a way to show the strength of our system of justice and what would happen if you went to a different system, which in this episode, everything's turned upside down.
Yeah, it's shocking because when you get into how the judge behaves and the constitutional issues in play, we have 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendment violations. There's no presumption of innocence. It does set a speed record for speedy trials.
They did, yes, they did abide by the Speedy Trial Act. No doubt about that. It was like 2 days. But there's one thing I wanted to add too, is that the one thing I would like to pick up from this episode is that the gavels that the judges use in Star Trek are much better than the gavels we use in the United States. It's either like this rock ball that sends sparks if you're Klingon, or this thing was another thing. You get to really bang it on the. I've never had a gavel like that before, so I was a little jealous.
I'm sure that could be brought up in a rules committee at some point in time. Well, let's we have the issues with the judge.
Yes.
We have ethical canons for judges. What are your reactions to how the judge handled, the O'Brien case?
Well, it's funny. So on one grounds, I actually agreed with her. When the defense attorney tried to withdraw from the case, she said you had to stay on, and that was the right call. Defense attorneys, if you take on a case, you understand you may not get the result you want. That's too bad. You got to stay on. And so she did that well. Other than that, though, no, not good. Again, the whole emphasis was on making sure that Miles O'Brien lost and got some horrible penalty. Now, sometimes they think it's death. Sometimes it can be commuted in some way. But that was her emphasis. And that's obviously not the role of a judge. The role of a judge is to make rulings in the case, but ultimately that's based on the evidence. It's based on the rules of evidence, whatever else might occur in the case. Here, it was preordained, and her job was to make sure it stayed on track in concert with the defense attorney for Miles O'Brien. So it was not a good situation. So no, I would not list that on my resume that I am, Mr. Cardassian judge school. That would not be a good thing to have on your resume.
Well, let's pivot over to a good defense attorney and a good trial that's fair from court-martial. And there are a couple big issues that we should talk about. Captain Kirk being on trial for the alleged death of one of his shipmates, where we have a prosecutor who dated Kirk, and the ethical issues with that. Your Honor, your thoughts?
Yeah, this one did not get started off on the right foot. So if you've seen this episode, Court Martial, which I think is a very good episode, there's a scene where they're in like a bar on the starbase. And, because it's Captain Kirk, of course, he dated the prosecutor in the case. But he doesn't know it at the time that she's the prosecutor. So he's kind of doing his whole lovey-dovey, Captain Kirk, the music soft in the background. And then all of a sudden, through this conversation, she says, you need to get a lawyer. He doesn't seem that concerned until she reveals, well, I'm going to be the prosecutor. And so the first thing that should have happened there is Lieutenant Shaw, who's a very good lawyer and very smart, the first thing out of her mouth should have been, I'm the prosecutor. I can't talk to you. Not, let's have drinks. let me give you some legal advice. In fact, they even said arrangements have been made for a defense attorney. The whole thing's a little weird. Probably not the way to get off on the right foot. So no, first, if you're an attorney, you all know this. If you're talking to someone who is potentially represented, and maybe they weren't represented at that time because Cogley was on the way, a little unclear, but be very, very careful having contacts with represented parties. It's a big, big no-no. You have to go through the lawyers. Putting that aside, you have the whole issue, which is up on the screen right now, about conflicts of interest. I mean, after all, she had apparently from the episode, very close relationship with Captain Kirk. May not even be over with at times, the way where they kind of look at each other in the courtroom. And that should never be an issue. If you have a personal relationship with the person you're prosecuting, get someone else to prosecute the case. Now, I understand on this starbase, it's the middle of nowhere. Maybe it's tough to find someone who can do it. And frankly, Kirk, I think at one point is asked to object to the hearings, the format, and he says, I have no objection. Maybe it can be waived, but boy, there are some safer ways of doing this. And yes, obviously, having sexual relations with someone, and I don't think this was during the trial, although it certainly suggests it wasn't too far before, and certainly might suggest it's going to happen again. Just steer clear, beam out of there. Don't do that.
Yeah. Other than that, awesome episode, and we'll talk about it in tomorrow's. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to be fair, it might be hard to find somebody who hadn't dated Captain Kirk. So.
No, that's tough. That's tough. The episode is, it's a good episode. It's a funny episode because on the one hand, parts of it are really good. I thought some of the courtroom scenes were very, very well done. But then also there are kind of some silly things like the fact that she dated a guy, the fact that they have a microphone, which apparently can eliminate all the heartbeats from everybody. Even though Mr. Spock can push a button and eliminate someone's heartbeat on the ship, like why'd they just, I don't know. Good episode. There are some holes.
Yes, and we will talk more about this on tomorrow's webinar for elimination of bias, because there are some wonderful issues here as well. So let's pivot over to the other big trial episode, Measure of a Man. And Bethany, your thoughts on Commander Riker's duty of loyalty and competency in prosecuting the claim against Data?
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to start by saying that my overall takeaway with analyzing Star Trek and the law is first that people have a lot of rights and they rarely invoke them. And I don't know if they're lawyers, they're just not aggressive enough in asserting their rights, but also that everyone in Star Trek must have a law degree, because a lot of them are appointed counsel a lot throughout various episodes, this being one of them. So the basis of the issue is that there's an engineer who comes aboard the Enterprise and wants to deconstruct and basically reverse engineer Data to figure out if they can create more of them. Data is, he's not unwilling to do it, but doesn't think the engineer has the technical expertise to be able to put them back together correctly so that he can retain all of his memories. And so, Data decides that he wants to object to this procedure. Captain Picard supports this objection and wants to defend him. And the judge basically says, Commander Riker, you have to argue that Data is not a human and therefore doesn't have any rights, that he's an android and doesn't have rights. This episode is a particular favorite of mine, just because it talks about a lot of philosophy about what it means to be human and what sentience is and all of that. But the question about Commander Riker personally, he expressed a lot of concern about representing this side. He didn't want to do it. He objected to it. The judge basically told him he had to. But in terms of the ethical rules, the question was he able to provide competent counsel? And he was. I mean, he put on a fabulous performance. There was a very shocking moment when he's arguing his case and he switches Data off and Data just turns off completely. And that's like a demonstration of you can't do that with people. You can't just turn them off. And so he made a very powerful and compelling case. And he also did disclose to Data that he had to do this and that he was uncomfortable with doing this, and Data said he was okay. Now, I think under the ethical rules, there would have needed to be some sort of written consent to the signature. But I think overall, this is one of the times that they may have gotten it right.
Now, Captain Picard had a relationship with the captain who was presiding as the judge in the case,
Yes.
and continuing tradition, she had also prosecuted him for the loss of the Stargazer, which I'm sure would ruin any relationship because there's no Hallmark card for that. What are your thoughts on any potential conflicts with her and presiding as the judge, having had a relationship with Picard?
I mean, obviously it's not great. I think that he had accused her of bias because she very, very zealously prosecuted him for the court-martial in the past. And so I think that certainly could have been grounds for recusal, but I do think she did her best to be a neutral arbiter.
Excellent, which brings us to another Next Generation episode, and that's Drumhead, which is a beautiful look at what a witch hunt looks like. And it's very much in the spirit of a McCarthy hearing after an act of sabotage on the Enterprise D, and a retired admiral who's called in and starts conducting hearings to figure out what happened, what caused this. And we're going to bounce between both the judge, Judge Owens and Bethany here to talk about some of the different issues of Betazoid intuition being used as evidence and a basis for trying to prosecute or restrict somebody's movement around the ship. So, Your Honor, your thoughts with, as looking at the evidence rule here, or from case law, when a government lawyer with enormous resources at their disposal abuses this power and ignores ethical standards, he or she not only undermines the public trust, but inflicts damage beyond calculation in our system of justice. Your thoughts on what happens with intuition being used?
So this is an excellent episode, and as we've spoken before, Josh, I'm a much more of an original series fan. Having watched some episodes recently of season one of Next Generation, I remain even stronger original series fan. But this episode is when Next Generation's at its best. This is a very, very strong episode. And what they're talking about here with the quotation you have on the screen, what the episode shows is that an unfettered prosecutor is a very dangerous thing. I was a prosecutor for many years before I became a judge, and so I'm familiar with the limitations and the approvals and the system checks you have to prevent something like this from happening. But when you allow someone to haul people into court based merely on this suspicion, Betazoid intuition, that's kind of a limitless power. Now, to be clear, the procedure here was not what we think of as a trial. I think your citation to the McCarthy hearings is more accurate. I think that's much more close to what's going on here, because at this point, he's not really on trial per se, but there is going to be some sort of hearing. So it's unclear whether all the procedural protections would normally be in place. But at the end of the day, based on the hunch or intuition of this Betazoid, this guy's career is ruined. Absolutely ruined. Now, we can talk about maybe it should have been ruined anyway based on some of the things he had done in the past. But you can see where this would go, because at one point, the prosecution calls Jean-Luc Picard to the stand and wants to ask him about actions he had taken in the past and about how maybe he still was locutus of the Borg and so forth. When does it end? Just because the prosecutor says maybe this person, maybe that person. So that's why, at least on the federal system, there are strong protections in place to hopefully prevent this type of thing from happening. If you're ever really curious about what the Supreme Court has said about this, I recommend to you the dissent by Justice Scalia in Morrison versus Olson, which was the case involving the independent prosecutor and some of the long-term dangers of that. Justice Scalia wrote about that, I think, and he was very prescient.
Thank you. Well, Bethany, let's pivot over to the fact that the Betazoid in cross-examination tells a lie in order to get an answer and trying to cause impeachment or in a way for the witness to incriminate himself. Your thoughts?
Yes, well, at this point, as Captain Picard points out, the trial is well on its way to becoming a drumhead trial. And at some point, they learn that what had caused the basis for the investigation, there was a piece of equipment that had blown up on the ship. They learned that it was actually an accident, that it was simply a product malfunction and nobody had sabotaged it as they suspected. However, they were still suspicious of several of the characters and wanted to continue prosecuting regardless. And during the interrogation of Tarsus, they basically said, what would you say if we told you the explosion was caused by chemicals, to which you had access, paraphrasing a little. And this is after they know that it wasn't. Now, of course, the way they phrased it could be taken as it not being a lie, because they didn't actually say that it happened that way. But it certainly, I think, would qualify as a false statement under ethical rules, because there was a very strong implication and they were trying to provoke a confession.
Let's take this a step further, that a lawyer may not offer evidence that the lawyer knows to be false. How close did they get to the line?
I mean, I think they're right over the line. I don't think that their artful phrasing was good enough lawyering to really be ethical.
And with that,
obviously, I was going to say, Josh, real quick, to be clear, investigators, police officers, FBI agents, they can use lies in interrogations to try to get someone they can say, well, we have 4 witnesses that saw you at the bank, even if they don't. That is permitted by the courts. The question here specifically is about what attorneys can do. And that's where it's a murkier question. So to be clear, don't think you can get off now or your client gets off because a police officer lied during an interrogation. They can still do that. The question here specifically is what can attorneys do, and there are more limits on that.
Very good point.
Yes. Now, Your Honor, we can only have charges if there's probable cause. Where do you think, when we look at the prosecutors in this case, I mean, if we're going to call them that as opposed to just an investigator, because they're starting to cross over, how would you qualify them? Are they doing things according to probable cause, or is this an investigation? Is it run amok? What are your thoughts?
I actually think this is a very complicated question. And last week when we were preparing for this, I think Bethany articulated some of the arguments in favor of the prosecution in this case for its reasons. I thought she did a very good job of it, so she certainly can jump in here. When they have information that the young officer lied about his background, he said that his grandfather was Vulcan, when in fact his grandfather was Romulan. And if you lie on forms, application forms, security clearance forms, that's a very bad thing. Under federal law, that's a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. Often in cases that might be difficult to prove that the guy is the really bad spy or really bad saboteur, you can get them on lying on their clearance forms. As to that crime, I think they clearly had every right to investigate that, because he did lie, and he actually lied. Bethany pointed out to me last week, he lied on the stand when he said his grandfather was Vulcan. So now he's committed perjury. He's committed a false statement. The next question is, can they keep pushing on that? Can they keep pushing on that? Originally, I was hesitant to go there. Thinking about it this weekend, I think Bethany made a good point. I think that there probably was probable cause to push this to a point, because here's what I say. You can continue to investigate it, but also there can be things that can come up to show that probable cause no longer exists, that you were wrong in the first place. And if that happens, then there is no probable cause and you should halt your investigation. It was clear from this episode, nothing was going to halt this investigation and this, if I can use the word, prosecution of this young man until kind of the big moment in the trial when Jean-Luc Picard kind of sends that zinger towards the Admiral. And, but for that, I don't think anything was stopping this freight train. As Worf says at the end of the episode, I can't believe I was part of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to point out that one of the accusations was that he was assisting in spying for the Romulans, who are current enemy, right? And so I think lying about being part Romulan is a pretty relevant lie to that charge.
Yeah, but you also have the fact he wasn't represented by counsel at that point in time. So I would think that could be used to defend him in some way. But anyway, not good and things that we want to avoid. Let's pivot over to Deep Space Nine from season 1 of Deep Space Nine, where we have Dax in an extradition hearing. So the brief setup, there's a general named Tandrell, who he and a couple thugs beam aboard and they try to kidnap Jadzia Dax because they claim that she should be prosecuted for the crimes of Curzon Dax. They get caught. There's a kerfuffle about whether or not they should extradite Jadzia, and they take the position that since it's a Bajoran space station, a hearing has to take place. So we have Cisco defending Jadzia. He also testifies as a witness, and there's all kinds of interesting issues here. So Bethany, why don't you take us through the issue of the general, if he actually brought a meritorious claim for the extradition of Jadzia for any alleged crimes of Curzon?
Sure. Well, without even getting to the merits first, I think that he knew that he did not have a meritorious claim because, I mean, he literally tried to kidnap her and take her away before he was caught and had to show the warrant and go through this whole extradition process. So, I mean, I think that's evidence that they didn't think they had a meritorious claim. And then the second thing was, when you're talking about probable cause, the only relevant piece of evidence they had that for this arrest was that she didn't have a verifiable, or I guess it was he at the time, didn't have a verifiable alibi at the time of the murder. So it's essentially like, there was a murder and I say I was at home, nobody can verify that, and that is the only grounds for arrest. I don't think that's probable cause at all. In fact, the general and Curzon Dax were friends, so there was no possible motive at that time. Sure, more evidence comes out later, but that's definitely the type of evidence that would need to be present at the time that an arrest warrant is issued.
Now, Your Honor, let's pivot over to one of the other issues, duty of candor. Do you think the general knowingly made a misstatement of fact about the extradition of Jadzia for crimes of allegedly committed by Curzon?
Issues to address. First, as Bethany discussed, the argument that this was a legitimate extradition, which he tries to make. He tries to make that saying, "Oh no, this is all by treaty." Then they quickly say, "Well, but this is not a federation. That's actually a Bajoran." So that was not a good faith argument that he made. He knew that was wrong. I mean, why are you going to go on the ship and try to kidnap this person if you could just send papers over and have it effected? So that is a clear violation of duty to candor. I think the much more difficult question in this case is that in the pursuit of Curzon Dax, was it okay to try to extradite Jadzia Dax? And on the one hand, you can say, well, as Cisco says, well, of course not. It's not the same person. But the Trill are very complicated how this all works. And I actually think that Tandro had a good faith argument that it was one and the same person, different host, but the same entity in a sense. And so I do think that there was a good faith argument in which the duty of candor. He didn't try to suggest that, in fact, it was the same person or the same entity all along. He made it very clear that, yes, it switched hosts, but the Trill was still the same Trill. So I think aggressive advocacy is okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And so I actually thought he was okay on that. Not good on the extradition, but creative legal arguments, as long as you're open with the court, I think that was all right. We're having trouble hearing you, Josh.
Oh, sorry. Well, let's talk about Captain Cisco, since I muted myself for background. He defends Jadzia and testifies as a witness. Your Honor, your thoughts on ethical issues with that?
Yeah, there are all kinds of ethical issues that come up when defense attorneys are forced to play a role of witness. So the first kind of practice point for all attorneys is that if a witness tells you something as an attorney and you want to get it into evidence, you need to make sure you take steps that can happen. For example, if you're meeting with a witness in a criminal case and you're a defense attorney, you want to have a paralegal or someone, an investigator, someone who can witness those statements if you want to use them to impeach the witness or somehow get them into evidence under some evidentiary rule. You never want to be in a position where the only person who can testify to certain facts is you, because that could lead to disqualification. What it also can do is that as a defense attorney, your sole goal is the best result for your client. However, as a witness, your sole goal is to tell the truth. And you can see situations where, as a defense attorney, there may be bad facts about your client you don't want to come out. Once you take the witness stand, potentially all those facts could come out. So it's a really, really bad situation, which is why with the rules that the ABA has put out, like they're trying to say, like, number one, uncontested issue. Number two, there's that limitation there. Number three, informed written consent. So it's very rare this is ever going to happen. There are safeguards to make sure it's limited in scope and form, but the real lesson here is just don't put yourself in the situation. Again, Benjamin Cisco, or Captain Cisco, or I forget, Commander Cisco at this time. There's not a lot of people on Deep Space Nine who apparently can step up and do this representation, so you got to kind of do it. But generally speaking, don't put yourself in that spot.
Well, let's pivot over to Voyager. So for their one main legal proceeding that they have, which is an arbitration, and the doctor writes a holo novel that really doesn't depict the crew of the Voyager in a positive light. They're upset. He realizes, I've hurt my friends. I don't want my public.
Not right away. He doesn't realize it right away. It takes a long time for him to realize that.
Yeah, it's a growing experience for him. So he eventually realizes, ooh, I was wrong. And then he realizes his publisher isn't recognizing his contractual rights to control his published works. So this raises interesting issues of representation, because as attorneys in California, we have a wonderful rule about never to reject for any consideration personal to himself or herself the cause of the defenseless or the oppressed. And the doctor's a holographic AI who wrote a book and wants to control his creative works. And Bethany, your thoughts first on the ethical issues of representing a potential new form of intelligence.
Sure. So, well, first of all, the title of this holo novel is Photons Be Free, which you can already tell it's a masterpiece. But it talks about the plight of holograms who are, treated as these subhuman entities. They're used for like harsh physical labor and aren't paid, and it's, modern form of slavery, and that's the commentary. And, they bring it up in the episode, and it's a recurring theme throughout Star Trek, which is that, we have often dehumanized other races and other kinds of people in order to justify our harsh treatment of them. Even in modern American law, for a long time, with like the Chinese Exclusion Act and Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is this very powerful dissent about the legal rights of African Americans and all of that. And even he has a section in there that basically implies that, oh, but that doesn't count because the Chinese are a race so different from ours that, they don't matter, essentially. And so the point is that, like, we have so often gotten, these issues of the defenseless and the oppressed so wrong, and that ethically, as lawyers, it's our job to constantly question our instincts and our, thoughts on these issues, and to reassess whether, holograms and androids and artificial intelligence or anything else that we're classifying as not fully human, whether that is actually meritorious or not.
Now, Your Honor, jumping off from what Bethany said, that this is a civil proceeding, so it's not criminal. So there isn't necessarily a right to counsel. Can you help us understand what civil Gideon is as a concept in the law?
Sure. So as we all know, there's the Gideon versus Wainwright, the seminal Supreme Court case. There was the movie Gideon's Trumpet, which is about how this criminal defendant won the right to have constitutionally guaranteed counsel. But as Josh indicated, that's only in criminal cases. And generally speaking, there is no right to counsel in civil cases. So the question is how do we get people representation? Well, sometimes there's a financial incentive. It could be attorney's fees if you win, and we see that in the Social Security area. We see that in the 1983, which is often police misconduct cases. In intellectual property, sometimes you can get fees if you prevail. So there's an incentive there for attorneys. You also have, for those who do personal injury law, of course, contingency fees, where in exchange for a large portion of the eventual settlement or judgment in the plaintiff's favor, you will agree to take the case and not charge the client any money up front. So those are all in place, but there still are those cases where there may not be a big financial payoff either through attorney's fees or through a contingency fee, and that's where the concept of civil Gideon comes in. So for example, child custody disputes. These are very important to families, as you might imagine, but there may not be a big financial incentive for an attorney to jump in. And so civil Gideon is this concept that academics, and it's really more of an academic concept right now than anything else, in certain types of cases, to permit or require there to be government counsel. That there be counsel provided to clients. For example, in child custody cases. There's a case right now before my court which involves minors who were brought to the United States from Central America and whether they get to have lawyers provided by the government in immigration proceedings. And so that's an example of this concept. But right now it's more of an academic concept than it is one in the real world, and I think this case is a good example of that. However, I think in this case, if this were, and I defer to Bethany somewhat, she knows more about intellectual property than I think I do, but I could see lawyers jumping on this case because conceivably he were to prevail and there was some sort of copyright claim or author's rights claim in this case, he could get considerable attorney's fees and also notoriety, which is what lawyers often are looking for.
And we should be clear that that case is not before you. So
I was involved in the original decision in that case. The case has since been taken en banc by a larger section of my court, and I am not on that panel. So I'm not on that case anymore.
So let's pivot over to both the first and the last episodes of of Star Trek: The Next Generation to talk about Q's trial of humanity and whether or not that was fair. And Bethany, you have written on this before, and why don't you help us understand the ethical issues with Q's trial of humanity?
Well, I'll start by saying that if Drumhead was Next Generation at its best, Q's trial was a Next Generation trial episode, and somewhat at its worst. I do love Next Generation. It is my favorite series. But it's basically, if you had to write an episode about the most unfair trial of all time, it would be Q's trial. So, Q is this all-powerful kind of godlike figure who puts humanity on trial for being a savage race, and basically what's at stake is the extermination of all of humanity. Q decides that he's going to be both the judge and the prosecutor. There's going to be no jury, that he's going to put forth these very vague charges about just being savage and use as evidence past genocides and things that happened centuries ago. The crew of the Enterprise, they don't have any rights. They're not given any rights. The chief of security is frozen when she, speaks out against it, which is definitely cruel and unusual punishment. He was absolutely not neutral. He basically told people to shoot Picard if he pled anything but guilty. He used the standard of guilty until proven innocent, because of course it would be unfair to put an innocent person on trial. And basically everything about this. And in the end, he settles on an old century concept called a trial by ordeal, which means you put somebody through some sort of test to determine their innocence or guilt. And, like things like the Salem witch trials, where, if you sank in the water, you were innocent, but if you floated, you were a witch. Those were all kinds of trials, but trial by ordeal. You also had trial by combat and those sorts of things, but they have generally been agreed as not fair trials. So basically, everything that could possibly be wrong with this trial was wrong.
Yes, it was. Well, let's talk about one of the big issues with fairness to opposing counsel. And Your Honor?
I was going to say one thing that I did like about Q, which I wish I had, he had that chair that could kind of move around the room up in the air. And I would love to have one of those in a courtroom. I've yet to see that happen, though.
Yeah, that would be pretty groovy.
Yeah,
Well, let's talk about...
Terrifying for the attorneys.
Well, let's talk about fairness to opposing parties and counsel with Q's conduct here. And Bethany, obstruction to a party's right to evidence and witness intimidation, suppression of evidence. We check all the boxes with Q.
We do, really, yeah.
Yeah, it's super, super scary. Well, Your Honor, we also have our judicial canon of ethics in California, which state a judge should uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary, a judge should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all of the judge's activities. Your reaction to Q as a judge?
So, look, I will be candid. The first episode of Next Generation is not my favorite episode of Star Trek. It got much better, the show, in later seasons. But I still think there's an important lesson to learn from the first episode, is that Q embodies the dangers of a judge, is that judges have a lot of power. I'm on the Court of Appeals, so I can only really act on panels of 3 judges. But district court judges, when you're the only judge in the courtroom, they have tremendous power. They can take over a prison system. They can take over busing for an entire community. They can hold in abeyance a congressional mandate. And that's an immense power that judges have. And so you hope and you pray, and they're reviewed by appellate courts to make sure that they are exercising their power fairly and within the constraints of their powers. Q shows what happens when someone has no limits on them, no one overseeing them. He can do whatever he wants. Now, we know he can do whatever he wants because he's this almost magical type figure. But it also is an allegory for what can happen when people in power don't have restraints. And he can just do whatever he wants, and there are never any repercussions to him. So one thing I always, with my colleagues on the bench, we talk about, and I think my court has gotten better about collegiality towards attorneys during arguments, is that as a judge, it's really easy to punch lawyers because they can't punch back. And there's a power dynamic there. And I think this episode does a really good job of showing what happens if you have the wrong person in that job as a judge.
Now, pivoting towards all good things, Bethany, what are your views on Q's continuation of the trial over 7 years later?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's another thing I was thinking about, because about the end of the series, Q comes back and is discussing the results of this trial and everything, and it's either double jeopardy, assuming the trial was resolved in these first issues, or like a violation of your right to a speedy trial. I mean, you should definitely have a trial within 8 years.
Agreed. So there's lots here, and we've hit most of the trial episodes from all of the trial Star Trek series. If you have questions, we can take questions now in the chat feature of Zoom. So please feel free to type away. And we did have one comment that in court-martial, they appeared to use the California Code, since those appear to be the books that Samuel Cogley had. And yes, they did. In addition to the King of Torts was on one of the episodes as the Friendly Angel, and his son is an attorney in Silicon Valley. So there's just a little fun connection there, as Nimoy's son is also an attorney focused on IP, if I remember right.
So one quick thing about Attorney Cogley, his love of books. As a lawyer, you need to, as much as you possibly can, use the best available resources to do your job. Now, sometimes it might be financially you can't afford to have Westlaw and Lexis in the 21st century, and I understand that. But in the 24th century or 23rd century, you have to be able to use the best technology. And using books for this guy was not. That was something he just thought was interesting to do, and it actually would detract from his performance as a lawyer. So if people are watching this in 2 centuries from now, don't rely on books to do your legal research. You need to do better than that. You got to be online.
But his offer of proof was what lawyers dream of giving in court. So he did rights. I speak of rights. So that's one of those moments that a lawyer's lying if they deny wanting to do that at some point in time. It's why we go to law school. So, yes, Bethany.
I was going to say, who do you think is the best attorney in Star Trek?
Oh, that's a tough one. Best attorney. Well, Kolos in Enterprise actually was a real attorney and really effective. And I really liked his closing and challenging the court. And that was a great, strenuously arguing for someone. I mean, I'll always love Cogley because, I grew up watching the reruns, and that did have an impact on me. But I really do think that Kolos was probably the best attorney that we've seen in any of the episodes.
I would agree with that, because he saved the captain from sure death. And as I said, he even went to the dilithium crystal mine with him. So that's going the extra mile as a lawyer.
It's a more in-depth look at the Klingon culture, with the fact that there were artisans and scholars, and how the culture got taken over by the warrior clans and the impact that had. It's also the Klingon legal system is probably the closest to ours. Judge Paul Graywall described it as very rough and tumble, but it's similar enough, where something like the Cardassian system would be more reminiscent of Stalin or, China under Mao, of something truly horrific, and that's a bad thing. We do have a comment from Jordan up in Oregon, who's blogged with us and done San Diego Comic-Con with us, and then he raises an issue with Drumhead, that he thinks the witness waived his right to an attorney, and that was a bad idea.
That's right. See, I told you, probable cause. He waived it.
It's like,
well, look, I mean, certainly it's when people say I have nothing to hide, we should take a moment and remind people why you have lawyers. It's when you have nothing to hide, that's all the more reason why you want to have a lawyer, to make sure that all your interests are being looked out for, to make sure that someone is not laying a trap for you to try to trick you into something. So, yes, I'm sure Tarsus, in hindsight, wished that he had a lawyer from the beginning.
Yes, always exercise that right.
Yes.
But that's lawyers saying that to each other. So we do have a question here saying that regarding the perjury lying criticisms, has there actually been a scene where the witnesses take oaths? Yes, many times. In all the actual trial episodes, so court-martial and Measure of a Man, it's the same system for taking oaths. The Klingon episode, I don't remember how it worked exactly, but definitely in the Federation courts, there was an oath that's reminiscent of ours. So good question, and worth looking back on Tribunal to see what they had, because I don't recall. Any other questions? So while that's waiting, we all did bring various toys. So yes, I have my communicator. Judge Owens is wearing his Star Trek ball cap and has model phasers out. So yes, we all are true geeks who love Star Trek. And
I got my Starfleet Academy shirt and a Star Trek watch face. I don't know if you guys can see that. But.
Again, people love Star Trek because it highlights the best of us. And each series has had at least one trial. And even Discovery, the end of the second episode was a court-martial. So they've maintained that through all of them. And we will see what happens in the future with the new Picard show coming out and what else could be awaiting us.
Now, Josh, you obviously are a true expert on Star Trek. I think of myself as a huge fan, but you're like another level. Would you agree that the fight scene at the end of Court Martial is the worst fight scene in all the Star Trek shows? Because he's so clearly not William Shatner in the fight scene.
It's that is problematic, but I still love it, and
Okay. All right.
I still love it. It's yeah, that body double issue is always one, but
even when the guy grabs a wrench, I mean, literally, there's a 20th century wrench on this starship. Like, they still need wrenches to fix the Enterprise, and he starts swinging. You're okay with that?
No, but when we're predicting the future, we have to think in terms of what will it look like, because we're trying to imagine things that don't exist, and we don't know what will exist. So the fact that they either help predict or we created, this, it's a track pads and everything. Now, we just had a question come in. Please send a link to the materials. If you look in the, not the Q&A, but the chat feature, there's a link right there, and I will grab it and put it into the answer as well. So that way you can have it. And we'll have a thank you email go out from the system, from Zoom, that can have this as well. And if that doesn't work, just email me at josh@thelegalgeeks, and we can get you the materials that way. But we really do appreciate everyone who logged in to join us. And if you have any more questions, because we do want to go, we have 2 minutes left for you and your gallant crew. And we have a chat. Oh, no link. Well, let's just type that in again. So it might have been dependent upon.
It's an ion storm.
Exactly. Who was logged in at the time? So I'll just posted that back in and posted it. So there are two ways to get it, either in the Q&A feature, it's in one of the answers, or in the chat. So if that doesn't come in, let me know. The record of attendance will be emailed to you. You will also get in an email with the evaluation. You'll also get a link immediately after this webinar to do it as a Google form as well. So stay tuned, and I really appreciate you all joining us for our first webinar. Tomorrow will be elimination of bias. That's still CLE pending, but hopefully we'll hear from the bar today or tomorrow morning. I want to thank both Judge Owens and Bethany for joining us, because we had a lot of fun preparing for this, because we're all huge Star Trek nerds and love this dearly. So toy collections were discussed in prep. So I'm sure everyone has their own treasures that they love as well. So with that, Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Your Honor, Bethany, thank you for being here. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.